Thank you very much, Ambassador Chowdhury. It really is a pleasure to be back in Pakistan after a COVID break, and I want to thank the Pakistani organizers for including me in this Margalla dialogue. In my remarks, I'm going to move from the specific to the general. And while much has been said already about Afghanistan, I still find a lot of people asking me and asking everyone, what happened and why? So here's the short version. After 9/11, the US came in anger to Afghanistan, seeking revenge in a country whose history and culture it did not understand that well. It then fell victim to mission creep, trying to create a Western model democracy on an accelerated timetable at the point of a gun. This resulted in massive corruption, inequality, and a fragile government with limited legitimacy living in a bubble in Kabul. This was exacerbated by the powerful military-industrial complex in Washington, which benefited from the war and wanted to keep it going. So inertia took over, and before we knew it, 20 years had passed. Negotiations did not really deal with the underlying realities of poor governance. So the Taliban movement, which was in many ways more indigenous and closer to ground reality, made persistent gains, and in the end, the government collapsed. Now, to be fair, the story is much more complex and nuanced than that, and even if everyone understood everything perfectly well in Afghanistan, it was going to be difficult to withdraw troops in a calm manner, as the events of August attest. But the more important question now is, what do we do? What do we do in the present? The Afghanistan story is far from finished. The Taliban government, as it's currently constituted, is no more representative of the whole of Afghanistan than the one it displaced. And it's going to have to adjust quickly to the new realities if it's going to last. The US plan had been to keep a robust diplomatic and development presence in Afghanistan, to work with a transitional government which would hopefully capitalize on the progress that had been made in important areas like education, health, and so on. Obviously, this didn't work out. The large US mission instead got caught up in the hysteria that gripped Kabul when the Ghani government collapsed. But the goal remains very important. The goal to help Afghanistan become a modern state responsive to all of its citizens. Of all the challenges in Afghanistan today, the humanitarian crisis is obviously the most urgent. Calls for a more robust humanitarian response are really reaching a fever pitch now. Humanitarian agencies are working around the clock to come up with innovative ways to deliver assistance to a population where the government is broke and the banking system has collapsed. I understand that modest amounts of cash have now reached Kabul into the accounts of various international NGOs so that they can resume their work, but a lot more needs to be done. The US and other Western governments are still focusing most of their energy, not all, but most of their energy on evacuating vulnerable Afghans. They remain in a wait-and-see posture, most concerned about avoiding any hint of recognition of the Taliban government. While this is understandable on one level, saving the lives of millions of Afghans should be the priority. This effort deserves the same kind of focus, the same kind of discipline as the US and others exhibited in the sprint out of the Kabul airport. A very useful guide on practical next steps has just been published by the International Crisis Group in Washington. It recommends freeing the $1 billion+ dollars from the World Bank Trust Fund. Some of that has already been released, but they recommend releasing the whole thing. Paying civil servants, easing sanctions to allow banks to operate, a regular engagement with Taliban officials, and a phased release of Afghan government assets. The EU and some European governments are now actively considering opening offices in Kabul to engage directly with Taliban leaders who are not on the terrorism list. The US would do well to consider doing the same thing, in my view. On the diplomatic side, there's been a lot of speculation around the world about permanent damage to the U.S. reputation of this unseemly exit from Afghanistan. And it really was disconcerting to many, and not just our friends, to witness what appeared to be such a visible defeat of a superpower. But I think the U.S. can recover if, and this is a big if, it stays engaged and does not repeat the mistakes of the 1990s. I personally believe that Biden was right to withdraw the troops from Afghanistan. And in the end, I think it's likely that he's going to appear both smart and courageous for having done so, because there is a strong possibility that removing the troops has opened the way to accelerate progress towards long-delayed reconciliation in Afghanistan. The U.S. withdrawal also, rightly in my view, put more of the onus on the region to take responsibility for assisting Afghanistan, for opening trade, for promoting the regional interconnectivity that many of the speakers have talked about, that remains crucial to economic growth and stability in the region. Happily, after some grousing and finger-pointing at the U.S., the region is stepping up, and Pakistan is very much in the lead in that process. I also believe that after all the public posturing and so on, that counterterrorism cooperation is in the interests of almost all of the regional powers, including the Taliban itself. So I'm reasonably confident that progress will be made in this regard behind closed doors. We won't hear about it, but I think progress will be made. Moving on to the bigger picture, the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan signaled the end to U.S. wars to promote regime change in the Middle East. President Biden invoked the need to focus on peer competitor China and to a lesser extent Russia as part of the justification for leaving Afghanistan. In fact, I think the U.S. had taken its eye off the ball in the last few decades as China quietly, under the radar, lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty and were busy stealing intellectual property and taking unfair advantage from the U.S. perspective of international agreements like the World Trade Organization. And during the same period, we underestimated Russian concern about the expansion of NATO and missed opportunities to chart a more constructive relationship with that country. The world moved from being bipolar between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to the U.S. being the sole remaining superpower, to a multipolar world, and finally now to a return to an almost bipolar U.S.-China competition. But in reality, we have now entered a phase which many are calling a plurilateral world, where the primary competition is between the U.S. and its allies and China. At the same time, the existential challenges of climate change and pandemics, and more recently the erosion of democracy and the international order, are very much upon us. Other speakers have commented very wisely on these challenges, as well as those posed by advances in technology and artificial intelligence and cyberspace and so on. I myself tend to think in more practical terms about what the U.S. and its allies need to do to respond to a rapidly changing world environment. So let me offer a few thoughts. First of all, we need to prioritize diplomacy over military means in foreign policy. The U.S. has long criticized other nations, including Pakistan, for allowing the military to become too powerful in foreign policy. But the U.S., in a way, has fallen into the same trap. And it's not that the U.S. military deliberately took power in the United States, but their needs and their advice took pride of place for far too long. But if diplomacy is to take its appropriate place in international affairs, diplomats need to up their game and sharpen their tools. First, we need to go back to basics, learning foreign languages, experiencing cultures more directly through more time on the ground, studying techniques of negotiation and persuasion, and how to find common ground. And this means not doing everything on Zoom. We need a revival in the United States, particularly, of the respect for expertise. This has been on the wane in the U.S. for some time, and this trend was exacerbated, sadly, by a general resentment of elites, which was encouraged by our previous administration under President Trump. And it was a lack of such expertise that was one of the problems that caused us to get so far off course in Afghanistan. We all need to practice the diplomatic traits that we expect from others, being open to new perspectives, listening carefully to the arguments of others, resisting the temptation to be impatient or judgmental. The U.S. and international development agencies need to reassess economic development models. There have been too many costly contractor-based projects which are disconnected from local priorities. Nation building, contrary to what you hear from many quarters in the United States, remains very important. Wealthier countries need to invest in poorer nations to help develop institutions which can improve governance and begin to bridge the inequality gap. But we need to do it in a way that takes account of local sensitivities and local priorities. Another tool of contemporary diplomacy needs to be a better understanding of the role of religion in various societies. Much has been done in the name of religion today, and much of it is very negative. You've got Hindu nationalism on the rise in India. Pakistan has problems with blasphemy and radical interpretations of Islam. There's a certain degree of Islamophobia in the West, and some evangelicals in the US are now hard to distinguish from white supremacists. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright explored the role of religion in foreign policy in her 2006 book entitled The Mighty and the Almighty. This should be required reading for US diplomats, in my view. And diplomatic services everywhere need reform. A senior State Department official recently suggested that we needed to de-sludgify the foreign policy establishment in the US. Take away the sludge, refresh the whole operation. Bureaucratic structures are outdated. Risk is not rewarded and can be severely punished. There's little incentive for innovation. I'm happy to report that the new U.S. administration is taking the need for reform very seriously and is working to diversify, streamline, and modernize the U.S. diplomatic corps. Outside the government, the so-called foreign policy elite, both in think tanks and the media, have for the most part slavishly followed the U.S. government line on the global war on terrorism. The pressure to be politically correct has been very strong and brought rewards, frankly, to those who complied. These institutions need to regain their independence and their crucial role in analyzing and challenging official policy. This could be extremely helpful today, for example, as the U.S. refines its policy towards China. The bottom line here is that diplomacy needs to again be the preferred means to settle international disputes. Military action needs to return to its appropriate place as, quote unquote, the last, not the first, the last resort of kings. But for diplomacy to succeed, it needs to be modernized and rejuvenated. And I hope my colleagues here on the stage and others of you in the diplomatic business will participate in that effort. Thank you very much.